There's a specific kind of person who never has to prove themselves. You've met one, maybe once, maybe years ago, but you remember them. They didn't talk the loudest in the room, they didn't have the best resume or the sharpest clothes. But when they spoke, people listened. When they walked in, something shifted. Not because they demanded attention, because they didn't need it. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a question formed that you probably never said out loud. What do they have that I don't? Here's what the research actually says. In 2010, psychologists Cameron Anderson and Gavin Kilduff at UC Berkeley published a study that changed how behavioral scientists think about confidence. They found that the people who rose to the top of social hierarchies, who were trusted, followed, respected, were not the most competent people in the room. They were the ones who acted most confidently, consistently, automatically, without thinking about it. Without thinking about it. That's the part that should stop you cold. Because if confidence isn't a decision, if it's something that happens automatically below the level of conscious thought, then the question isn't how to build it. The question is, what's been blocking it? And that answer lives somewhere most people never think to look. Let's start with something most people get completely wrong about confidence. They think it's a personality trait. Something you're either born with or you're not. The loud kid in school who never seemed afraid of anything. That was confidence. The quiet one in the back of the room. That wasn't. But that's not what the science shows. In the 1980s, a psychologist named Albert Bandura at Stanford introduced a concept he called self-efficacy. It wasn't about personality, it wasn't about genetics, it was about belief. Specifically, your belief in your own capacity to handle what life puts in front of you. And what Bandura found, after decades of research, was that this belief isn't fixed. It's built. It's shaped. It's influenced by experience, by environment, by the people who were around you when you were still forming. Which means something important. If confidence is built, it can also be dismantled. And most of us, without ever knowing it, had ours dismantled very early. Think about the first time you were told to be quiet when you had something to say. The first time you raised your hand and got it wrong in front of everyone. The first time someone you loved looked at you, not with warmth, but with disappointment. You were maybe 6, maybe 8, maybe 10 years old. You didn't process that as feedback. You processed it as truth. That's the thing about a young mind. It doesn't have the filters an adult brain has. It doesn't say, well, maybe they were having a bad day. Maybe they didn't mean it that way. A child's brain takes what it receives and builds its architecture around it. Quietly, permanently, without asking your permission. And here's where it gets interesting. Jung spent decades studying what happens to the parts of ourselves that don't fit the picture we're expected to present to the world. The emotions that were too big. The desires that were too strange. The parts of our personality that got a reaction we didn't want. Shame, rejection, silence, and so we learned to push them down. He called that collection of rejected parts the shadow. Not a darkness in the moral sense. Not something evil or broken, just hidden, stored. Alive in the basement of your psychology while you go about your life upstairs pretending it isn't there. And here's what nobody tells you about what lives in that basement. Your confidence is down there too. Not destroyed, not gone. Just buried under everything you were told, directly or indirectly. You needed to hide in order to be accepted, in order to be safe, in order to belong. Bandura's research showed that self-efficacy erodes most dramatically in childhood through what he called vicarious experiences and social persuasion. In plain language, watching the people around you fail and be humiliated for trying, and being told in 100 different ways that certain parts of you were not welcome here. By the time most people reach adulthood, the architecture is already set. They walk into a room and something tightens in the chest. They have an idea in a meeting and something stops them from saying it out loud. They meet someone they're drawn to and something pulls them back before they even take a step forward. They call it anxiety. They call it introversion. They call it just the way I am. But it isn't just the way you are. It's the way you were shaped. And there's a profound difference between those two things. So let's talk about what's actually happening inside you when confidence fails. Not philosophically, mechanically. Because once you see the mechanism, you can't unsee it. And that's when things start to shift. There's a structure in your brain called the amygdala. You've probably heard of it. It's the part of your brain that processes threat, fear, danger, and it's ancient, far older than the part of your brain that reasons, plans, reflects. The amygdala doesn't think, it reacts. Its entire job is to scan the environment for anything that looks like a threat and respond before your conscious mind even knows what's happening. Here's the problem. The amygdala cannot tell the difference between a physical threat and a social one. A lion chasing you, a room full of people waiting for you to speak. To your amygdala, those two things produce the same internal response. Heart rate spikes, palms sweat, breath shortens. The body prepares to fight or run. And you're standing there trying to give a presentation. In 2008, neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman at UCLA published research showing that social pain, rejection, exclusion, humiliation, activates the exact same neural regions as physical pain. Not metaphorically, literally. The brain processes being rejected by a group the same way it processes a broken bone, which means every time you held back, every time you didn't speak, every time you made yourself smaller in a room, your brain wasn't being weak. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was protecting you from pain. The issue is that protection came at a cost, because every time the amygdala fired and you retreated, it learned. It logged that moment as confirmation. See? That was dangerous. We were right to pull back. And the next time a similar situation arose, the threshold got lower. The reaction came faster. The retreat happened sooner. Neuroscientists call this process sensitization. The more a neural pathway is used, the stronger it becomes. The more you avoid, the more automatic avoidance becomes. Until one day you're not even making a conscious choice anymore. The pullback happens before the thought. The silence comes before the decision. And you experience it not as fear, but as personality. That's just who I am. But here's what's underneath that story. Jung wrote something in his later work that didn't get nearly enough attention. He observed that the shadow, all those buried, rejected parts of the self, doesn't disappear when we suppress it. It accumulates energy. It pushes. And the more we refuse to acknowledge it, the more it starts to express itself indirectly. Through anxiety, through self-sabotage, through that maddening pattern of almost saying the thing, almost taking the step, almost letting yourself be seen, and then pulling back at the last second. That almost is not weakness. That almost is your shadow, pressing against a door you've kept locked for a very long time. And the research supports this in ways Jung couldn't have fully anticipated with the tools available to him in the early 20th century. A landmark 2011 study by Kristen Neff at the University of Texas found that self-compassion, the ability to acknowledge your own pain and inadequacy without judgment, was a significantly stronger predictor of psychological well-being than self-esteem. More than that, people with high self-compassion showed lower cortisol levels, lower amygdala reactivity, and, here's the part that matters, higher willingness to take social risks. They were more confident, not because they thought more highly of themselves, but because they had stopped running from the parts of themselves they'd been taught to be ashamed of. The door to confidence doesn't open from the outside. It opens from the basement. From the place where everything you were told wasn't good enough about you has been sitting in the dark, waiting not to be fixed, but to be seen. That's the mechanism. And now that you understand it, the next question becomes the one that actually matters. How did yours get built? There's a moment in most people's lives that they don't talk about. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was violent or obvious or the kind of thing that makes it into a story you tell at dinner, but because it was quiet. And quiet wounds are the ones that go deepest, because nobody sees them. Nobody names them. And so you never get to name them either. Maybe it was a parent who was physically present but emotionally somewhere else entirely, who provided everything you needed: food, shelter, safety. But when you looked for something to reflect back at you, something that said you matter, you're enough, I see you, there was just a kind of absence there. A blankness. A child doesn't interpret that absence as their parent's limitation. They interpret it as their own. Maybe it was a classroom, a teacher who used you as an example of what not to do. A group of kids who laughed at exactly the wrong moment. The moment you were brave enough to try something, to be something, to show something real about yourself. And in that laughter, you heard a verdict. Don't do that again. Or maybe it wasn't one moment at all. Maybe it was just the slow accumulation of 1,000 small corrections. Sit down. Tone it down. Stop being so sensitive. You're too much. You're not enough. Be more like your brother. Be more like the kids who seem to have it figured out. Stop asking so many questions. Stop taking up so much space. And you did what any intelligent child does. You adapted. Developmental psychologist John Bowlby spent decades studying what he called attachment theory, the way early bonds between children and caregivers shape the internal working models we carry into adulthood. What he found was that children who grew up in environments where emotional expression was met with withdrawal, criticism, or indifference didn't stop having emotions. They just learned to hide them. From others first, and then, gradually, from themselves. That hiding became a habit. That habit became a reflex. That reflex became a personality. And by the time you were old enough to walk into a job interview, a first date, a room full of strangers, the hiding was so automatic you didn't even know it was happening. You just knew that something tightened. Something pulled back. Something in you said, "Careful. Not too much. Don't let them see." Here's what's important to understand. That response was intelligent. It was the right adaptation for the environment you were in. A child who expresses freely in a home where expression isn't safe gets hurt. The suppression was protection. The shadow was built not out of weakness but out of survival. But you are not a child anymore. And the environment has changed. The people in that room are not your parents. The colleague waiting for your idea is not the teacher who humiliated you. The person across the table is not the group that laughed. But your nervous system doesn't know that yet, because nobody ever told it that the war was over. Bessel van der Kolk, the psychiatrist and trauma researcher, wrote something that stopped me when I first read it. He said the body keeps the score, that our unprocessed experiences don't vanish. They live in the tissue, in the posture, in the automatic responses that fire before thought. The tension in the jaw before a hard conversation. The smallness that creeps into the shoulders in a room full of authority. The voice that drops half a register when you're about to say something that matters. That's not anxiety. That's memory. Your body remembering a time when being fully yourself had consequences. And here's the thing about memory. It can be updated. The brain is not the static, fixed structure we once believed it to be. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to rewire itself based on new experience, is one of the most well-documented phenomena in modern neuroscience. What was built can be rebuilt. What was learned can be unlearned. But only if you're willing to go back to where the learning happened. Only if you're willing to look at what's been living in that basement. Not to relive it, not to be consumed by it, just to finally, after all this time, acknowledge that it's there. Because the wound doesn't need to be dramatic to be real. And it doesn't need to define you, but it does need to be seen. So here's where most conversations about confidence go wrong. They get to this point, the wound, the pattern, the years of quiet suppression, and then they pivot. They say something like, now that you understand it, here's the 5-step process to fix it. Here's the morning routine. Here's the affirmation. Here's the framework that will rebuild what took decades to dismantle. And something in you knows that's not right. Not because the tools don't work. Some of them do. But because they're working on the surface of something that lives much deeper. You can stand in front of a mirror and repeat words about your own worth for a year, and still walk into a room and feel that same tightening in the chest. Still hold back the idea. Still make yourself a little smaller than you actually are. Because the problem was never that you didn't know you were capable. The problem is that a part of you, a very old, very tired, very frightened part, doesn't believe it yet. And that part doesn't respond to logic. In the 1990s, psychologist Richard Tedeschi at the University of North Carolina began studying something he called post-traumatic growth. Not the absence of pain after a difficult experience. Not recovery in the sense of returning to who you were before. But genuine transformation. People who came through periods of deep psychological disruption and emerged not just intact, but fundamentally different. More open. More present. More themselves than they had ever been. What distinguished these people wasn't resilience in the traditional sense. It was integration. They didn't push past what happened to them. They didn't reframe it into something positive or file it away under lessons learned. They sat with it. They looked at it directly. They allowed the parts of their experience, including the parts that were painful and confusing and didn't fit any neat narrative, to become part of the whole story of who they were. Jung called this process individuation. The lifelong work of becoming a complete human being. Not a curated version of yourself that the world approved of. Not the persona you constructed to survive your particular childhood in your particular environment, but the full thing. The contradictions and the wounds and the gifts and the darkness, all of it. Held together, owned, integrated. And what happens to confidence in that process is remarkable. It doesn't get built like a structure you construct from the outside. It gets uncovered. Like something that was always there underneath the weight of everything you were taught to be ashamed of. There's a research thread that points to this with striking clarity. Psychologist Mark Leary at Duke University spent years studying what he called sociometer theory. The idea that self-esteem functions not as a measure of our actual worth, but as an internal gauge of social acceptance. When we feel accepted, the gauge goes up. When we feel rejected or excluded, it drops. And most of us have been unconsciously managing that gauge our entire adult lives, presenting the acceptable parts, hiding the rest, exhausting ourselves in the maintenance of an image that feels safe enough to show the world. The cost of that maintenance is enormous, not just emotionally, cognitively. Every interaction becomes a performance. Every room becomes an evaluation. Every conversation carries the low hum of, are they accepting me right now? Am I safe here? Am I enough for this particular audience in this particular moment? That's not living. That's auditing. And the people who seem effortlessly confident, the ones you noticed at the beginning of this video, the ones who walk into a room and shift something without trying, they are not people who have a better answer to that audit. They are people who have largely stopped performing it. Not because their lives were easier, not because their wounds were smaller, but because somewhere along the way, through experience, through therapy, through suffering that finally broke something open, they made contact with the parts of themselves they had been hiding, and discovered that those parts weren't the problem. Those parts were the power. There's a concept in Jungian psychology called the golden shadow. Most people know the shadow as the dark side, the anger, the fear, the shame. But Jung was equally fascinated by what he called the light shadow. The gifts, the strengths, the capacities we suppress not because they're ugly, but because at some point showing them felt dangerous. The intelligence that made other kids uncomfortable. The sensitivity that got called weakness. The natural authority that was punished because it threatened someone who needed you smaller. You didn't just bury what was broken. You buried what was brilliant. Let me tell you about a study that most people in the self-help world have never heard of. In 2005, psychologist Stephen Hayes at the University of Nevada published the foundational research behind what he called acceptance and commitment therapy. ACT, as it became known, wasn't built on the premise that you need to think more positively. It wasn't about reframing your negative beliefs into positive ones. It was built on something far more counterintuitive. The idea that the attempt to control your inner experience is itself the problem. Hayes and his colleagues found something that contradicted decades of conventional psychological wisdom. The more aggressively people tried to suppress unwanted thoughts, emotions, and memories, the stronger those experiences became. The harder you push something down, the more pressure it builds. The more energy you spend not feeling something, the more that something begins to define your life from the inside out. He called it experiential avoidance. And he found it at the root of almost every form of human psychological suffering he studied. Anxiety. depression, chronic low confidence, the persistent sense that you are somehow less than what you could be. All of it traced back, in significant measure, to the same fundamental pattern: the refusal to make full contact with your own inner experience. Now hold that next to what Jung was saying half a century earlier. The shadow doesn't weaken when you ignore it. It strengthens. It finds indirect ways to express itself. It shows up in the relationships you keep choosing that diminish you, in the opportunities you systematically talk yourself out of, in the dreams you have at 3 in the morning that leave you with a feeling you can't quite name but can't quite shake either. Two completely different traditions. Two completely different methodologies. The same observation. What you refuse to face runs you. So what does it actually look like to stop refusing? This is where I want to be careful, because this is the part of the conversation that gets cheapened very easily. People hear "face your shadow," and they think it means some dramatic confrontation, a breakdown, a retreat in the mountains, an ayahuasca ceremony. And maybe for some people it looks like that. But for most people, the people I'm thinking about right now, the ones who have been quietly carrying this for decades, it looks much smaller than that, and much more difficult. It looks like pausing the next time you feel that familiar pull to make yourself smaller, and instead of obeying it automatically, just noticing it, not fighting it, not analyzing it to death. Just, there it is again. That old thing. I see you. It looks like saying the idea out loud even when something in you is screaming that it isn't good enough yet. It looks like letting someone see you uncertain, see you imperfect, see you in the middle of something rather than only at the polished end of it. Researcher Brené Brown at the University of Houston spent over a decade studying vulnerability and shame. What she found, and what her data showed with remarkable consistency, was that the people who reported the highest levels of connection, belonging, and yes, confidence, were not the people who had the fewest insecurities. They were the people who had decided that their insecurities didn't have to be hidden in order for them to be worthy of being in the room. That decision, quiet, private, unremarkable from the outside, is the turning point. Not a transformation, not a breakthrough, a decision. I am going to stop spending my energy hiding the parts of me that I was taught were unacceptable. And I am going to find out what happens when I do. What happens, the research suggests, is this. The amygdala response begins to recalibrate. When the thing you feared, being seen, being imperfect, being fully present in a room, stops being avoided and starts being approached, the brain gradually updates its threat assessment. The neural pathway of avoidance weakens from disuse. A new one forms. Not confidence as performance. Confidence as familiarity with yourself. As comfort with the full range of what you are. There is a particular quality that the most genuinely confident people share. Jung noticed it. Researchers have documented it. And if you think back to that person you remembered at the beginning of this video, the one who shifted something in a room without trying, you'll recognize it. They are the same in private as they are in public. Not perfect. Not fearless. Not without doubt or insecurity or the occasional 3 a.m. spiral. But the same. What you see is what's actually there. And that consistency, that absence of the exhausting gap between who you are and who you're pretending to be, is what the nervous system of everyone around them picks up on without knowing why. It's not charisma. It's coherence. And coherence is not something you perform. It's something you recover. If you've made it this far into this video, I want to pause for just a second. Not to summarize what we've covered. You already felt it. But to say something directly. If this conversation is landing somewhere real for you, if something in what we've been exploring together is touching a part of your life that you don't usually let yourself look at, then I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel. Because this is what we do here. Every single day, we go into the places most people walk past. We ask the questions most conversations are too polite to ask. And we do it with the kind of seriousness that the subject deserves. Hit subscribe. Come back tomorrow. Because the person who watched this video today is not the same person who pressed play at the beginning of it. And that matters. Now, let's talk about what this actually looks like in a life. Because understanding is one thing. And understanding can feel like progress. It can feel like the work itself. But Jung was very clear about something that often gets lost in how his ideas get translated into popular culture. Insight alone doesn't integrate the shadow. Knowing about the basement doesn't clean it out. Something else is required. In the clinical literature, the word that keeps appearing is exposure. Not in the dramatic sense. Not in the sense of forcing yourself into situations that overwhelm you before you're ready. But in the precise, deliberate sense of making gradual contact with the experiences your nervous system has been treating as threats. Psychologist Peter Lang at the University of Florida spent decades building what became known as emotional processing theory. What his research showed, and what hundreds of subsequent studies confirmed, was that fear structures in the brain are not dismantled by understanding them. They are dismantled by activating them in a context where the catastrophe doesn't happen. In plain language, you have to enter the room, not with a strategy, not with a script rehearsed so thoroughly that you never actually have to be present, but genuinely, with the willingness to be seen, to be imperfect, to say the thing that might land wrong, to take up the space you've been quietly apologizing for taking up your entire adult life. And then notice that you survived. That sounds almost insultingly simple, but the mechanism is real and the research is solid. Every time you approach what you've been avoiding, every time you speak when something tells you to be quiet, every time you stay in the discomfort instead of retreating from it, you're giving your amygdala new data. You are updating a file that was written a very long time ago with information that is no longer accurate. The file that says, "This is dangerous. Stay small, stay hidden, stay safe." It gets rewritten, not through argument, but through experience. Now here's the part that connects everything we've covered today. The shadow work and the confidence work are not two separate projects. They are the same project. Because what lives in your shadow, what you buried, in order to survive your particular childhood, your particular environment, your particular version of being told that parts of you were not welcome here. That buried material is not just pain. It is capacity. The anger you learned to suppress became the inability to set a boundary. The sensitivity you learned to hide became the inability to trust your own perception. The ambition you learned to shrink became the habit of talking yourself out of things before they even begin. Every quality that went into the shadow took something with it. And the return of those qualities, the slow, unglamorous, entirely unsexy work of bringing them back into the light, is what genuine confidence actually is. Not the performance of certainty, not the absence of fear, but the presence of yourself, all of yourself. The parts that were approved and the parts that weren't. The parts that are still rough and the parts that have been polished by decades of living. The parts you're proud of and the parts you're still making peace with. That wholeness, that integration Jung spent his entire career pointing toward, is not a destination you arrive at. It's a direction you choose, again and again, in small moments, in ordinary rooms. In the split second between the impulse to hide and the decision to stay. That split second is where your life actually changes. Not in the dramatic moments, not in the breakthroughs. In the quiet, repeated, almost invisible choice to be a little more present than you were yesterday. A little less managed. A little more real. I want to leave you with something that isn't a summary. Because everything we've covered today, the research, the mechanism, the wound, the shadow, the slow work of return, none of it means anything if it stays in the realm of information. And you already have enough information. That was never the problem. So instead, I want to leave you with an image. Think about the person you were at 7 years old, 8, 9. Before the adaptations fully set in, before the hiding became automatic, before the gap between who you actually were and who you learned to present to the world became so familiar that you stopped noticing it was there. That child wasn't fearless, wasn't perfect, wasn't without confusion or hurt or the ordinary difficulties of being a small person in a large and sometimes indifferent world. But they were present. They took up their space without calculating whether they deserved it. They felt what they felt without immediately editing it. They wanted what they wanted without immediately talking themselves out of it. Somewhere between that child and the person watching this video, something got interrupted, not destroyed. Interrupted. And the work, the real work, the work that no framework or 5-step process can shortcut, is simply the work of finding the thread back to that person. Not to become a child again. Not to pretend the decades of experience and adaptation didn't happen, but to bring that original presence forward into the life you're actually living now. Jung wrote near the end of his life that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Read that again. Not to improve yourself, not to optimize yourself, not to become the best version of yourself. That phrase that has been repeated so many times it has lost all its weight. To accept yourself completely. The parts that are still unfinished. The parts that didn't turn out the way you planned. The parts you're still embarrassed by at 3 in the morning when the noise dies down and there's nothing left to distract you from yourself. That acceptance, full, unconditional, unsentimental, is not the consolation prize for people who couldn't achieve confidence. It is the foundation that genuine confidence is built on. Because a person who has made peace with all of themselves has nothing left to protect. And a person with nothing left to protect walks into a room differently. They speak differently. They listen differently. They move through the world with a quality that other people feel before they can name it. That coherence we talked about. That absence of the gap. That sense that what you're seeing is actually what's there. That is not a gift some people are born with. That is the result of work. Quiet, private, unglamorous work. The kind that doesn't make for a good story until much later. The kind that happens in the ordinary moments of an ordinary life when you choose, just slightly, just incrementally, to be a little more honest about who you actually are. You've been doing some version of that work today. Just by staying, just by listening, just by letting some of this land in the places it was pointing toward. That's not nothing. That's exactly where it starts. If this video reached something real in you, share it with 5 people who you think are ready to hear it. Not to teach them something. Just because some conversations are better when you don't have to have them alone. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment below. Not about what you thought of the video, but about what you're still carrying. What question is still open for you? What you'd want us to go into next? Because that comment might become the next video. And that next video might be exactly what someone else needed to find. The child you were already knew how to take up space. You just forgot that you were allowed to.